Okay, this is going to be a conversation I'm going to enjoy because Trump is rolling out tariffs. And as I told you before, Trump loves tariffs. He has an older might not even be appropriate, a different, more protectionist view of it, very much a Teddy Roosevelt Republican. Everyone thought he was just threatening Canada and Mexico, so they'd throw some Mexican troops on the border. And as I told you, yeah, it's part negotiating tactic, but he's bringing tariffs. He loves them. He always has. He believes in them. Joining me now to talk about them, the moves, the potential counter moves, and other things, the wonderful Carol Roth, who knows a lot about this stuff, author of the book, You Will Own Nothing. In fact, she's wrote a lot of wonderful books at this point in time. Okay, Carol, as I've explained to people, Trump is a tariff lover. It's a very much an older Republican way of thinking, but this is what he loves. It's what he believes in. I don't care how many Canadians get put on the border. Tariffs were always coming for somebody.
I love the fact that they keep talking about, well, in the 1800s, we had all of these tariffs and it paid for everything. Okay, we're not in 1800 anymore, people. We're in 2025. Our economy looks nothing like it did in the 1800s. The currency looks nothing like it did in the 1800s. Our fiscal foundation looks nothing like it did in the 1800s. So, while that's a nice, thing to say, it's a completely irrelevant data point. And as I've mentioned to you prior, Jesse, I'm sort of a centrist on tariffs. There are things that we absolutely need to be producing here in the United States. I know you will probably agree with me when I say, our defense industry should not be outsourced to China. We cannot depend on them for our defense, and they're not going to be super excited to make things like weapons and components for us if we're potentially going to attack them. So there are things from a national security standpoint that it makes sense for us to reshore and use tariffs as a means to incentivize that. There are a whole bunch of things that it makes absolutely no sense to reshore, and we couldn't do it if we wanted it because the cost of those goods and services would be so high that nobody would buy them. And this idea that somehow we're going to eliminate the income tax and replace that with tariffs, like was done, back in days yonder, is absolutely insane because from a math perspective, that is never going to work. So now we're in the situation where I do think that there is a little bit of art of the deal. What somebody said about Trump is that you should take him seriously, but never literally. So there is some scoring of some points and some bravado. But you were absolutely right. He likes tariffs, and he sees that as an interesting, out of the box way of thinking. I do think there are other people in the administration that have other out of the box ways of thinking. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. But this discussion is not going away for sure.
Carol, let's rewind just a little bit because we all want to get smarter, myself included. Lord knows I need enough help with that. What's different now? You said we're not at all the same as we were in the 1800s. I agree with you. Dumb that down so I can understand it. What does that mean?
So, if you think about the currency that we have the global reserve currency, something that we didn't have prior. We have a currency that is fiat, that's not backed by anything other than the promises of the government. We have debt to GDP at 120+%. We're running deficits that are wartime level deficits between 6 and 7% of GDP. We have, because of our currency, we have dollar strength that needs to be considered vis-a-vis not unfortunately a bag of groceries, but strong against other currencies in the world. We have a global market that depends on the U.S. treasuries, not only to finance the government, but as a safe haven for the world. So we're in this very complicated scenario. We also have a service-based economy, right? So, it used to be that the economy was based on manufacturing goods, and now 70% of that is based on services. So, by the way, you have a government that takes in $5 trillion of our money every year, more than the GDP of every other country in the world, except for the U.S. and China, and now is spending $7 trillion. So, I think if you kind of line that up to what things look like in the 1800s, it's a little bit different.
Okay, so what does this mean for me and my wallet, Carol? I have 2 kids. I have a wife who likes purses. What does this mean for me? Am I going to get poorer in the short term, in the long term? What does this mean?
Well, I think it could mean a lot of things. I think if Trump wants to continue to do tariffs on everybody and their brother, there are a couple things that are going to happen. There is going to be a direct impact if you decide to buy a foreign good instead of a U.S.-based good. And, maybe you can convince your wife that she should buy U.S. designers instead of something fancy from Europe. I don't know how that's going to go. I'm going to stay out of that situation. That's your problem, not mine, Jesse. But there's also, the idea of what's going to happen with the strength of the dollar. Tariffs increase the dollar strength, which means that they're going to probably have to find a way to weaken the dollar if they want to do tariffs, which means, and we've talked about this before, that could create an inflationary scenario, which we know is coming anyway, because there are a whole million things that are going to create an inflationary scenario, and it's already on the rise again. So I do think, as all of these things get sorted out, one is that you should be considering buying U.S. Over what is being manufactured abroad. But the reality is that I think that life is going to continue to stay expensive. We're not going back to prices, of what they were 5 years ago. That is a pipe dream. So the most important thing that you can do is you can ask for a raise, Jesse. So here I am asking your bosses, give Jesse a raise because he's going to need the extra money to help buy his wife purses and other, kind of cost of living. So everybody needs to make sure their wages are keeping pace because that's the only fight that we really have against inflation. And also, as we've talked about before, over time, and I'm sure they're going to come down at some point, but over time, expect that hard assets, stocks, things like that are going to inflate as everything else inflates, as we have seen over the past, decade or so.
Carol, what does China do in response to all this? Because China, obviously, he's coming with tariffs for China. There's no ifs, ands, or buts around it. So China is reportedly building a fortress to prepare for these tariffs. What does that mean? It sounds great. What does it mean?
So one interesting thing, and this may completely divert our conversation, but that's fairly normal for me, is that China's been stockpiling gold. And it has been doing that for many, many reasons. One of them is to decrease the dependence on the US dollar. Another is to create a way to settle their own trade if they're trading with other countries and somebody doesn't want to accept their currency, to offer credible settlement in terms of gold. So this could end up in a situation where there's a meeting of the minds here, and for all of these different points that are going on, there could be a discussion of, well, maybe we should, write up and all agree that the price of gold is higher than it is because it's suppressed anyway. If that happens, and we're going to divert from China for a second, by the way, right now the U.S. has gold on its balance sheet at just over $42 an ounce. And we know that it's trading at over $2,900 an ounce today. So if the U.S. and China agree, if they were to just write it up to the $2,900, that would then give them like something in the area of like 700 and something billion dollars that they would then be able to have in their treasury account to spend monetization of gold. But if they all agreed to write it up even higher, hey, now gold is, $4,000 an ounce or $6,000 or whatever it is, not only will that help the U.S. help to weaken the dollar, do all the things that we had just been talking about, but also potentially be a boon for China and a way to kind of get around all of these other machinations that are going on. So I would imagine that there is going to be some table meeting with China, because the reality is we do depend on them still for quite a lot of things, but there is sort of this concern that we need to get around that. China has, some issues, but it also has some strength. So this is like a really big game of, I don't know if it's risk, I don't know if it's 4D chess, I don't know what the appropriate analogy is. But as I've been telling you for a while, the global financial order is on the precipice. It is going to shift, and I think we're going to see that start to come to fruition sooner versus later. It could be this year, Jesse.
Carol, have I ever told you how dominant I am at risk? Just absolutely dominant. Undefeated? No. But when I sit down to play Risk, I guess just Napoleon and me, our minds just work differently. I'm dominant at Risk.
I feel like you should put that on your resume. That should actually be probably the top thing is that dominant at Risk. Yeah.
Yeah, I should. Carol, shifting gears a little bit, but just because it matters to people, interest rates. People, they want cars and they don't want to pay these ridiculous interest rates. They want to own a home one day. What a shock. The American citizen wants better interest rates. Are we ever going to get those?
Oh, Lord, not anytime soon, unless, as we've been talking about, there is this weird out-of-the-box thinking and resetting of rates. I have been telling you for years, and your viewers and listeners for years, that what the Fed is doing doesn't matter. That their tool set just doesn't apply to where we are. And I have been proven right because, when the Fed hiked interest rates initially, what happened to yields on the 10 years? And then ultimately everybody's interest rates went up, right? But what happened when they started cutting interest rates? Yields went up again. And that's because they no longer have that control. It is being determined by the market, it is being determined by fiscal policy, and their own policy is completely off the table. So as I noted, right now, the yield on the 10-year is rising again. It's getting to levels that are potentially concerning, even amidst the fact that we had these rate cuts previously from the Fed. And those are unfortunately, what is going to drive a lot of the rates in the market, especially on the mortgage side. That is a relevant point, as well as demand for mortgage-backed securities. And we just don't have the demand in the market for all of the treasuries that we're issuing for the mortgages. So I feel like for the time being, rates are going to get higher. Now, what could happen is that there is a break point. There is a point which we're getting close to where rates will become too high, particularly on a 10-year as the benchmark, and that could send us into a debt spiral that could end up breaking the global financial markets if we get to that level. And again, we got real close to it. We've come back off a little bit, but we're in that neighborhood. The Trump administration does not want that to happen. They cannot afford for that to happen for many, many reasons. And so that means, again, you may see some kind of an interventionist policy to try to bring down interest rates. And whether they go crazy and say, oh, we're going to bring them way down so we can refinance the debt and people can have better mortgage rates and all these kinds of things, or they do kind of an interim step, is really anyone's guess. But it's not going to come from free market forces. It's going to come because they are forced by our fiscal situation to come in and do something quote unquote creative. And that's, again, why I'm in the camp of seeing persistent inflation, because they would rather have goods and services be a little bit higher than bust the entire financial system or cause a massive recession or whatever it is. And so those are going to be the choices at hand. And which one politically do we think they're going to pick? They're going to pick a little bit more inflation. It's just the unfortunate choice that they're going to have to make.
Yeah. God save us from central planners getting creative. Gosh, that would be a freaking disaster. Carol Roth, thank you, ma'am. Come back soon.